Welcome to the Mindful Mobility Tech Talk. My name is Karl Pepple. I'm the West Coast Collaborative co-lead. Penny McDaniel sends her regrets she could not be here today due to an unexpected family emergency. Today we're discussing federal funding 2020 and beyond. So you see here poll results. The first question was, how many participants had applied for funding from the agencies represented on the webinar today? And around a third of you indicated you had. Of those who received, one third of you indicated you had applied for funding. Of those who did apply, over 40% indicate that you did receive funding from one of these federal agencies. This webinar is one of a series aimed at keeping practitioners up to date. We're going to get going with the webinar now. Next slide, please. We are doing this in part with our friends at the Green Transportation Summit and Expo. We had intended to have a joint Green Transportation Summit and Expo and West Coast Collaborative Partners meeting this year, where this topic was going to be one of the panelist discussions. The pandemic intervened, and now we are doing this virtually. Please take a look at our sponsors here who help make this possible today. And finally, please check out the GTSE website for additional information on the upcoming annual meeting in 2021 and upcoming webinars. Speaking of upcoming webinars, let's go to the next slide, please. Please mark your calendars for these two upcoming webinars. The first is Accelerating EV Implementation through Software and Resource Support. And the second is Part 5 of Preparing Your Transportation Workforce for Tomorrow. This information can be found on the GTSE webpage. We have 4 excellent speakers today. I'm going to introduce each speaker before they present their slides. We will have 1 to 2 questions for each speaker after their presentation. Once all speakers have presented, we'll have a more extensive Q&A session. Next slide, please. Some housekeeping issues. Please make use of the chat button down below. If you have questions throughout any of the presentations, please type them in the Q&A box. They can be replied to live from presenters who can type answers in while we go through this, or we can go through them during the Q&A period. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to attendees, as well as a version of the slides. Those slides will be distributed to attendees after the webinar concludes. Next slide. Our first speaker today is Faye Swift. She's the DERA Grants and Policy Team Leader with the US EPA Office of Transportation and Air Quality. Faye began her career as an EPA intern in the Region 5 Great Lakes Program Office. She moved on to the Region 5 Air Programs branch as the Tribal Air Coordinator. In 2005, Faye transferred to the Mobile Source Team in EPA's Region 2 office, where she began her work with voluntary diesel emission programs and diesel grants. Faye is a proud graduate of Michigan Technological University with degrees in environmental engineering and biology. She is an excellent colleague and a wonderful resource. With that, Faye, please take it away.
Thank you, Karl. Hello, everybody. It's good morning out there, good afternoon out here. My name is Faye Swift, and I am the team leader for EPA's Diesel Emission Reduction Act funding program. So I'm just going to give kind of a high-level overview of our program, what we do, and how to participate. Next slide. So again, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the program and then talk about our individual funding opportunities, which are our school bus rebates, our state grant program, our national grant program, and our tribal grant program. I'm going to touch on some of our overall program results throughout the history of the program and some tools and resources for potential applicants. Next slide. So DERA was authorized by Congress in 2005, and we received our first slug of funding in 2008 and have received funding annually ever since. And the main purpose of the funding is to achieve reductions in diesel emissions and exposure from the nation's legacy diesel fleet, and particularly in areas of poor air quality. And we do this by incentivizing fleet owners to purchase new, cleaner vehicles and engines and remove the old polluting engines from service. Alternatively, we pay for retrofit technologies and idle reduction technologies and other things which achieve diesel emission reductions. Next slide. So this just shows a little bit how the program is structured. By statute, when we get our annual appropriation, we split that funding into two big pots, and that is our national competitive programs and our state program. And I will talk about all of these in more detail as we move forward. The pie chart shows how then the funding is distributed amongst the programs. So, last year we received 87 million, and a little over half goes to the national program, and again, 30% goes to the state program. And in the recent years, we've allocated 10 million to our school bus rebates and 2 million to our tribal program. Next slide. So I'm going to start with the school bus rebate program. It's our simplest program and one of our most popular programs. And the purpose of the program is to replace old school buses with new, cleaner school buses. So because this is a rebate program and not a federal grant program, the administration and paperwork is much simpler. So there's a one-page application, and it's a lottery selection process, so it's not competitive in the sense that you're getting scored and ranked, but we use a random number generator and pick the winners, although we do guarantee one rebate per state. And the fleets are reimbursed about $20,000 per bus. There's less than 1 year from the application for the rebate to the notification and selection, and then purchasing the bus, scrapping the bus, and receiving your rebate funds. Ideally, if all goes well, that's less than a year from start to finish. The old vehicle, the old bus must be scrapped before the recipient can receive their rebate payment. And this is very timely. Our 2020 program opens this week. So there will be an announcement later. Well, all the program materials will go up on our school bus website on the 1st, so later this week. And the link is right there on the slide. Next slide. So the state grant program is a lot like our national grant program as far as what you can do and what we'll pay for and what the eligibility criteria are. So I'm not going to go into that in detail on the state program. I'll talk about that in the national program. But the state grant program is a non-competitive formula grant. So we take that 30% of the funds, and all 50 states plus the 4 territories are eligible to participate if they choose to. So if they choose to participate, they receive a share of that state DERA funding, and then they can implement their own diesel emission reduction programs with that funding. Local fleets can participate in state-run programs depending on what the state does with their funds. Sometimes they already have their fleets and vehicles selected, but oftentimes they will then run their own competitions that people can participate in. So there's information on the state grants on our website if you'd like to know more about that, as well as all of the program participation guidance and materials. Next slide. So I'm going to go into a little more detail again on the national grant program. It's where we put the bulk of our money, And the rules for the national program apply to most of our other programs in the same way. So this is an annual competitive request for applications. So, applications are reviewed and scored and ranked and selected competitively. The main activities under DERA grants are the retrofit or replacement of existing diesel engines, vehicles, and equipment. The technologies and engines that are purchased need to be EPA verified or certified technologies, or CARB verified and certified technologies. So we don't fund R&D, we don't fund commercialization. We only fund things that are commercially available and already certified or verified by EPA and CARB. Next slide. Eligible applicants for the National Grant Program include government agencies and nonprofits. Specifically, it says agencies with jurisdiction over transportation and air quality, but we use that term pretty loosely. It doesn't mean that you have to be a regulatory agency. It just means you have to have some control or input over transportation or fleets, or transportation policy, something like that. Nonprofit organizations also have to have a nexus with diesel fleets or transportation and air quality as their principal purpose. We do not allow private entities to apply directly to EPA for DERA funding. However, both public and private fleets can receive DERA funding through partnerships and programs with eligible DERA grant recipients. The types of vehicles and engines we fund include buses, class 5 through 8, heavy duty highway vehicles, marine engines, locomotive engines, non-road engines. For example, those used in construction, cargo handling, agriculture, mining, and energy production. Next slide. In DERA, we do have some funding priorities, so we give points for certain types of projects or projects that take place in certain areas. And we prioritize areas of poor air quality. So this includes non-attainment or maintenance areas for PM 2.5 or ozone. And it also includes areas that are in the 80th percentile nationally for diesel PM exposure. And this is based on our National Air Toxics Assessment data. So we provide a list of that within our competition. It's by county, and we specify which counties are these priority areas. So you'll know, which projects fall in these areas. You don't have to make that decision yourself or that distinction. We also prioritize goods movement projects. So these are projects that affect ports, airports, rail yards, terminals, and distribution centers. There's a whole slew of funding restrictions and eligibility criteria that you need to look at the individual funding announcement. Sometimes there are changes year to year. So you need to look at each specific RFA for all the criteria and restrictions, but I wanted to point out a couple of the big ones. When you're applying for a DERA grant, it's a national announcement, but the projects are competed and selected regionally. So when you are planning your projects, you have to think on a regional, EPA regional basis. So a project, an application is submitted to each region, or you need to choose which region you're applying to for your project. So, you can apply to multiple regions and implement projects in multiple regions. I'm sorry, hold on, please. I'm terribly sorry about that. My doorbell was ringing. Okay, so you may only request funding from one EPA regional office. The second one is that the federal funding limits per application vary by region. So this is the upper bound on how much money you can ask for. And it varies from about 100,000 up to, I think, like 4 million, 5 million in Region 9. So the size of the project varies by each region depending on how much money is available in the region. And there is no minimum project size. Another big one is that replacement projects do require vehicle scrappage. So if you're purchasing new trucks, new equipment, new engines, the old vehicles, trucks, and engines need to be taken out of service and scrapped. Next slide, please. So this shows the specific eligible technologies and the DERA funding levels. So EPA only pays for a portion of the vehicle or the technology, and the recipient must pay for the other share of the project. So we fund drayage truck replacement, vehicle or equipment replacement, and there's a sliding scale for the type of technology. So diesel trucks get 25% funding, low NOx trucks get 35% funding, and zero emission trucks would get 45% funding. Similarly, for engine replacement, there's a sliding scale depending on the technology. And you can see we fund different types of idle reduction technologies. We fund, which include shore power, truck stop electrification, locomotive shore power, things like that. We fund exhaust retrofits, engine upgrade retrofits, and also alternative fuel conversions. Next slide, please. So that, is a real big overview, a real high level overview of the national program. Our tribal grant program is very similar to the national program. It's an annual competitive RFA. It's only open to tribal entities. So these are federally recognized Indian tribes and tribal consortium. And it's similar but different. We offer more flexible vehicle eligibility criteria. We offer a reduced grantee cost share. And we're a little more flexible in our timelines and application period. So again, you can find more specific information on that program on our website. Next slide. So that, again, I know it's real quick and high level, but that's an overview of how our funding programs work. These next couple of slides are some results from our last report to Congress. So they're a little old now. We have our new report coming out early next year, which will be through 2018. But this was, so 8 years of the program from 08 through 16. You can see these are our cumulative results. And it's pretty exciting. We've awarded over $600 million in funds. We've replaced over 67,000 engines, retrofitted or replaced, and reduced tons and tons of NOx and PM and other pollutants. So we're very proud of our program results. Next slide. And I know there's a lot going on this map and it's really hard to read, but this represents our different projects under the different programs and where they've taken place. And I think kind of the key takeaway here is you can see where our projects overlap with those areas of poor air quality. So the shaded areas are the non-attainment areas and the air toxics assessment areas. And you can see that the grants, tend to land in those areas. Some of the more rural dots and things you see are the school bus rebates. because again, they are not prioritized based on air quality, they're a random selection. Next slide. And this is just a breakout of overall, and this would be based on like number of engines, number of vehicles, the types of sectors where we've done work. And you can see that our biggest sectors are long haul and school bus. Over the life of the program, I will say a lot of the long haul numbers came from early in the program. We don't see as many long haul projects these days. It would be interesting to kind of do the same analysis, but with just maybe like the last 5 years or so of the program, and see how this trend, see how these trends have changed. So we'll definitely be looking at that in the future. But I like the slide because it shows, all the different types of projects that we do fund. Refuse haulers, agricultural tractors, all kinds of port equipment, transit delivery, stationary generators. So it's a pretty broad brush of things that we fund. Next slide. And similarly, these would be the same vehicles, but these were then the technologies that were funded. Again, that idle reduction technology number is really high based on early years of the program when we would pay for things like APUs at 100%. We don't do that anymore. And we did a lot of them. They're relatively cheap. So, there'd be maybe like 500 APUs purchased under one grant or something like that. So again, these days we don't fund as much idle reduction, but we still do. And, nowadays, in the last probably 5-6 years of the program, the vehicle replacement and engine replacement are our most popular projects. Next slide. So this is just what's coming up next. So if you are interested in DERA funding, your next opportunities are coming up soon. As I just said, the 2020 school bus rebate program opens this week, and that will be open for 1 month. The next opportunity will be the national RFA. So the 2021 national DERA RFA is slated to open in November. It'll open November or December. We're trying for November, but we'll see. No later than early December though. And then in March of 2021, we will release our next DERA tribal RFA. And right after that, the state program will roll out. Again, that's not a competitive program. It's not open to the public, but states that want to participate in the next year's program will have those materials will come out in the spring. And then about a year from now, we will offer up our DERA school bus rebates with the last of the 2021 money. Next slide. So, all of this information plus a whole lot more is available on our website. We have separate pages for each program. All the program materials are there. And we also have some helplines. There's the DERA helpline. You can send them an email or you can call them, and they're very responsive. We also have, I didn't really talk about the diesel emissions quantifier. This is the tool that our applicants and grantees use to calculate their emission reductions. So this is available on our website. It's publicly available. You can create an account and use it, whether you're a grantee or not. And you can put your fleets in there and play around with different technologies or different reduction strategies and see what kind of results you get. So that's a useful tool as well. And we have a listserv that you can sign up for, and you'll receive funding announcements when new programs roll out. You'll get an email with any upcoming things that may be of interest to you, but we won't spam you. We don't use it very often. So that's all I have. I'm not sure I wasn't watching my clock close enough. If we have time for a few questions now, or if we
Thank you, Faye. We've got a couple of really quick questions for you before we move on to Michael Laughlin. The first question is regarding eligibility. And could entities in U.S. territories apply for DERA? And what about public universities applying directly for DERA?
The territories are eligible, very much so. And the territories are eligible to participate in the state grant program, as well as anyone, any eligible entity, whether it's a governmental entity, a local, or a nonprofit group that's located in the territories would be able to apply for the national program. I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Public universities.
So public universities are tricky, and it depends on if they're considered a state organization. And if there's some question about the eligibility, I would recommend you to reach out to me directly or reach out to the DERA at EPA.gov helpline. So, one second, I'm sorry. So it's hard to answer that question. Like, I need more information. So I think the criteria is that they need to ultimately be a state-run organization or a state agency is the defining criteria. But if that's not making sense, just reach out to me separately and we can ask the right questions and get a determination.
Got it. Thank you very much, Faye. Let's move on to Michael Laughlin. Michael is the technology manager of the Technology Integration Program at the U.S. Department of Energy. His role at DOE's Technology Integration Program is management of their day-to-day technology integration projects, as well as serving as an interface between that program and the Vehicle Technologies Office research programs. He has more than 25 years experience in alt fuels and advanced vehicle technologies with the Department of Energy. He holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Akron and an MBA from Walsh University in Ohio. Mr. Laughlin, take it away, please.
Great, thanks very much. Next slide, please. So thank you for the opportunity to talk with you about funding from the DOE Vehicle Technologies Office, or VTO. I'm going to be careful to make sure that I spell out my acronyms when I do this. Today I'll provide some information on our office's activities for medium and heavy duty vehicles in particular. I'll also talk about some specific activities within the Technology Integration Program, or TI, which is where we support our Clean Cities coalitions. While unfortunately it's not possible for me to talk to you about specific future funding opportunities at DOE, I can take a few minutes to speak about some of our previously funded projects and discuss some of VTO's motivation in doing them to give you a feel for the types of projects that we have sought in the past. Just as a reminder, the Vehicle Technologies Office solicits projects through funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs, that usually have different sets of topics for each year based on critical research needs that we've identified through our program plans and information from our stakeholders, and VTO doesn't typically issue the same FOA topics year to year. Next slide, please. So let's start with our most recent work. This is the list of topics in our 2020 FOA. DOE released this in January 2020 and announced the project selections in July. You can find a list of those selections on the Vehicle Technologies website at vehicles.energy.gov, and I'll make sure we get that into the chat, as well as any other link that I might mention today. I realized I didn't put this on the slide. This slide highlights that VTO covered a broad range of topics across major vehicle technology research and demonstration areas, and also many of our topics offered opportunities for medium and heavy duty vehicle work. So the topics you see highlighted in red were ones with opportunities for medium and heavy duty research, and as you can see, 10 of the 18 topics included such opportunities. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to provide some more detail on topics in the 2020 funding opportunity announcement that were specific to the Technology Integration Program and to our Clean Cities community. So give you somewhat of an idea of some of TI's past topic interests and how they included medium and heavy duty vehicles. So one of our 2020 topics covered gaseous fuels like hydrogen, natural gas, and propane to demonstrate these technologies in vehicles of all sizes. This work sought to reduce the cost and advance the commercialization of gaseous fuel technologies. Our proof of concept topic sought projects to demonstrate small numbers of commercially available advanced technology vehicles in fleets or regions that have not yet had significant experience with them. So one example of this that we did select for funding would be heavy duty electrification in a cold climate. The electric vehicle and charging community partners topic covered the creation of regional partnerships for local charging ecosystems to serve business and consumer use of electric vehicles. This would include the development of electric vehicle charging corridors, workplace charging initiatives, and freight and transit electrification as some examples. And finally, the open topic was our way of seeking proposals for new ideas within the alternative fuel and advanced technology space that weren't covered in our other 2020 topics. Although Clean Cities Coalition participation is always encouraged with our TI topics, this one in particular required it. Next, please. So getting a little bit more specific and moving back in time a bit to 2018, I wanted to highlight VTO's Natural Gas Vehicle Research Consortium. Our goal here was to address some specific technical needs that were hindering the development and deployment of an alternative fuel technology, in this case, natural gas. We feel that this consortium was a significant achievement for us as it involved funding from 3 different agencies: the California Energy Commission, the South Coast Air Quality Management District in California, and DOE. Balancing the competing and complementary priorities among 3 very different agencies was challenging, as you might expect. However, these agencies were able to come together to jointly fund projects addressing objectives of mutual technical interest, such as lowering the total cost of ownership for these technologies, improving natural gas engine and vehicle emissions, and expanding natural gas engine and vehicle availability. We feel like the joint consortium approach allowed us to have a larger technical impact than any one agency could have alone, allowed us to leverage funding of all 3 of our agencies and coordinate research among the agencies. Just as a timing note, the RFP was issued in September of 2018. We announced awards in March of 2019, and the projects kicked off about a year ago in the summer of 2019. Next slide, please. So this eye chart slide provides more details on the projects selected, including the project description, funding, and timeline. It illustrates the breadth of projects that we funded covering natural gas engines and components, fueling technology, and emissions aftertreatment. We feel like there's also a pretty good balance among larger companies, smaller technology companies, and academia. All of these projects will be presented at the 2021 Natural Gas Vehicle Technology Forum. We'll be talking about their project status and accomplishments. So that meeting's still in the planning stages, so I unfortunately can't offer a specific date for it at this point, but I'm sure that the Clean Cities Network will hear about it as soon as we pick one. So next slide, please. So this slide covers our Living Labs projects that the Technology Integration Program funded in 2017, going back another year. TI's purpose for these projects was to explore a variety of mobility technologies like ride sharing, first mile, last mile transport, and freight logistics in a city or regional settings. These technologies are relatively new to TI's portfolio, and some are new to the transportation world in general. So we wanted to invest some funding to test these concepts in the real world and see which worked and which didn't, as there wasn't, and in some cases still really isn't, much hard data or experience on how these technologies work in the real world. So the first project listed there, the Seattle project, was an electric shared mobility project, which encouraged the adoption of light-duty electric vehicles and shared mobility applications and developed tools to overcome the main barriers to EV adoption in this application. And by shared mobility, I mean car sharing. So the electric last mile project in Austin connected neighborhood residents to transit with a small light-duty electric shuttle for last mile travel. And finally, the last one on the list there, the New York State project in energy efficient freight logistics looked at opportunities for increased energy efficiency for both the supply and demand sides of freight logistics. Since this one deals specifically with medium and heavy duty, I'll talk in more detail about this project on the next slide. Next, please. So in this project, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the Prime, their work aims to reduce freight energy use by pairing efficient supply side technology and operations with freight demand management techniques in the Albany to New York City corridor. The project demonstrates the mutually reinforcing effects of demand side and supply side efficiencies through the adoption of energy efficient logistics. So one example of what I mean by mutually reinforcing demand side and supply side efficiencies is the combination of off-hour deliveries and electric vehicles. So off-hour delivery allows carriers to use more vehicles more effectively in both day and night shifts and making them more financially viable. Electric vehicles reduce energy consumption and minimize externalities such as noise and pollution. So off-hour delivery fosters the use of electric vehicles through operating the trucks for more hours of the day. And this makes them more financially viable as fuel and maintenance savings are accrued more quickly with more miles driven per year, yielding faster payoffs of the incremental vehicle costs. And then electric vehicles facilitate implementation of off-hour deliveries by reducing the unwanted externalities of conventional trucks like noise that are particularly undesirable in overnight deliveries. To date, RPI has cataloged 52 initiatives that can provide solutions to many given issues pertaining to land use and transportation planning. This catalog is available on their project website, which also includes some interesting tools to estimate freight activity at the business and zip code levels and to simulate freight vehicle flows through a metropolitan area. Next, please. So getting a little more specific to VTO's technology integration program, our team really wants to, one of the things we want to do is to solve real world problems for transportation with our funding opportunities. And one example of this is our projects that we did on training for code compliant maintenance facilities for gaseous fuel vehicles. The overall goal of these projects was to enhance the safety of gaseous fuel garages. Two teams led by the Gas Technology Institute and Marathon Technical Services collaborated to create a single curriculum during these projects, which wrapped up about a year ago. So we gathered input from our stakeholders and feedback at industry events, and also received direct information from Clean Cities coalitions to identify this training need as a critical gap for adoption of CNG, LNG, propane, and hydrogen. The multi-fuel approach demonstrates how we can successfully help solve a real world problem for a fairly broad set of adopters with just 2 projects covering multiple fuels. The project teams partnered with multiple Clean Cities coalitions who had the local connections to make the workshops well attended and successful. And finally, this project was more than just regurgitating code to officials, which wouldn't, just feeding them their code back to them wouldn't effectively solve the real world problems. The projects took an interactive hands-on approach with case studies, online instruction, and picture-rich manuals. Next, please. The TI program wants to enable strong community-based partnerships to accelerate the adoption of alternative fuels and infrastructure, particularly through encouraging corridors for those fuels. And certainly we have some collaboration with Diane Turchetta, who will be talking next to us about the same topic. One example of a project we did was our Michigan to Montana project to deploy alternative fuel infrastructure along the I-95 corridor. The project really centered on infrastructure along the corridor, but also aimed to develop some deep partnerships that would outlive the particular project. During the project, those partnerships created planning and implementation frameworks to provide outreach, deploy vehicles and infrastructure, and create a sustainable market for alternative fuel vehicles. Multiple Clean Cities were involved in this work. This is a good example of the benefits of being part of a Clean Cities coalition. Local coalitions created community-based partnerships which when they were all combined along the length of I-94, built what we think is a robust corridor with long-term potential because it was locally driven to meet everyone's local needs based on that Clean Cities input. Several other elements of this project ensured its success. This includes developing infrastructure with both public and private access as we feel a more sustainable long-term strategy for infrastructure success. The project also included outreach to consumers with activities like a booth at the Chicago Auto Show. And the team also pursued first responder training for areas where vehicles and infrastructure were to be deployed. And one final note is that the project did spur one partner in Chicago, Ozinga, which is a concrete hauling company, to commit to adding more vehicles and public CNG stations to their fleet. Next, please. Last thing we're going to talk about today, at least in terms of meeting our goals, is technology integration seeks to enable informed decisions by its stakeholders by removing barriers to adoption, such as a lack of information or real-world experience with these technologies. The Southeast Alternative Fuel Deployment Partnership is one example project in this area. This project focused on medium and heavy-duty applications in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. This project gets at the question that fleets often ask of themselves and others, who's doing what I want to do, and are they doing it successfully? And obviously, how can I learn from that experience? This real-world experience to inform their decisions is particularly useful in the medium and heavy-duty space. This project accomplished this task through strategic partnerships, drawing on existing fleets that are already using these technologies to create peer-to-peer exchanges for new fleets to adopt the technology. The project funded the incremental cost of vehicle and infrastructure technologies, as well as data collection to create summary reports and performance metrics to inform outreach to a broader community of fleet adopters. This project also covered a wide range of partners, from very large companies like UPS and Waste Management to local municipalities like the City of Atlanta and DeKalb County. One user, Maccabee Trucking, was new to alternative fuels at the start of the project and has now adopted both CNG and propane for its mail delivery business. Now, while this project focused on case studies and peer information exchange as a main focus, the team also worked to build out infrastructure along the corridors within the project area, thus addressing another barrier to adoption. Next and last slide, please. So, although it doesn't say anything other than questions, a couple of thoughts to wrap up. As many of you are probably aware, submitting a proposal for federal funding requires a lot of organization, so it's best to have your project ideas at least sketched out on paper, so you're as ready as you can possibly be for these FOA releases that we provide, rather than trying to do all that work after the FOA hits the street. Our Clean Cities coalitions are intimately familiar with the FOAs that we issue. I strongly recommend that you get to know your local Clean Cities coordinator if you don't already. And finally, we at TI are always open to hearing from our Clean Cities coalitions and other stakeholders about what issues they're having in their regions that could potentially be addressed with federal funding help. Our contact information is all on the Clean Cities website at cleancities.energy.gov. So please feel free to reach out to us or to your local Clean Cities coordinator if you have ideas. Thanks, and that's all I have. I'll be available for a couple questions.
Michael, one quick question for you before we move on to Diane Turchetta. During Faye's presentation, she indicated that Congress allocated around $82 million for the fiscal year 2020 DERA program and all of the things that it covers, whether national, state, tribal, et cetera. Could you give us an idea about your funding source and the annual magnitude of those funds? Yeah,
the funding source comes from the Technology Integration Program's annual budget, which we receive through Congress. And our TI annual budget is on the order of about $40-ish million, give or take a few. It changes from year to year depending on how Congress feels about us. And a portion of that, some of it goes to support for our lab work and other things, but a portion of it goes to FOAs like this. I believe the FOA in 2020 had about $30 million in it for technology integration projects, if I'm remembering correctly.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Diane Turchetta, and just a reminder to folks that we will have an additional question and answer period after the conclusion of the presentations. Diane Turchetta is a transportation specialist in Federal Highway's Office of Natural Environment. She primarily works on transportation and sustainability issues. She's had 20 years of experience with Federal Highway in various positions, working on a variety of transportation-related air quality matters, including energy use, alternative fuels, and freight emissions. Before joining the US DOT, Diane worked for the US Environmental Protection Agency on fuel-related issues. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Public Administration from Penn State and a master's degree in Public Administration from Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Diane, please take it away.
Hey, thank you. I always say the public administration makes me the ultimate bureaucrat. So I'm not sure that's something to be proud of or not. But anyway, let's start with my overview slide. What I want to talk to you about today is a little bit about the Alternative Fuel Corridors program, and then provide some information on Federal Highway funding for various alternative fuel projects. Next slide. So under the last Transportation Reauthorization Act, which was the FAST Act, DOT was required to designate corridors for various fuels. For them, actually 5, but the first being plug-in electric vehicle charging, so electric vehicles, hydrogen fueling, propane, and natural gas, both compressed and liquefied natural gas. And this program under the FAST Act had no funding. So what is offered under this program instead of funding is highway signage. And we'll get into that a little bit as we talk about the program. Next slide. So this slide takes a look at our program information to date. We've had 4 rounds of requests for nominations. The way it happens is we are directed to accept nominations from state and local officials for the highways in their state or their area, the region they want to designate. So we started in 2016, the first year under the FAST Act. You can see the numbers there, and 2017, 18, and most recently the 4th round. 2019 was round 4. So we're pretty happy. If you see the cumulative numbers there, we have 100 nominations received altogether over the 4 years, 119 interstates designated, 100 US state highways, US and state highways designated, because we said we were looking at the entire national highway system. In number of states, we have 49 states plus the district that either have a corridor ready or corridor pending designation, which means basically a corridor ready designation means the infrastructure is there. It meets all our criteria, which we'll look at in a minute, and it's eligible for highway signage. A pending corridor means there's a little work to do and some gaps to fill in infrastructure. And all the designations cover about 145,000 miles of the NHS, National Highway System. Next slide. So we are approaching our time of year that we request nominations. This will be the round 5, the 2020 under the FAST Act. This will be the last official designation under the FAST Act since it expires tomorrow, September 30th. We're planning to issue the request for nominations in October as soon as possible. And this will be distributed through the highway division offices, which then in turn distribute the RFN to the state DOTs and their metropolitan planning organizations. The nominations are due usually late winter, early spring 2021, and then we'll actually, the nominations are due. The designations will be made in the spring of 2021, and there's really no anticipated changes in fuel criteria for this last round. Next slide. So here's a look at the criteria we've used in 2016. We of course revisit this every year with our stakeholders and with industry, and mostly with our colleagues at the Department of Energy. I think most of the changes to date have been in the EV corridor area, and lately, or last round, in round 4, we made an additional change, and that was for DC fast chargers. We required to be a station that met the criteria to both have a CHAdeMO and CCS connector. And as I said, we don't really anticipate any other criteria changes for the fuels in this next round. Next slide. So I think many of you are familiar with Federal Highway's Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Improvement Program. It's been a great friend over the years to alternative fuel projects. And I think if you tallied it all up, probably a big source of funding for projects across the country. Of course, CMAQ's eligible for alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure and non-attainment maintenance areas. However, under MAP 21, that was the transportation reauthorization before the FAST Act, what happened was the EMV and CNG refueling infrastructure was just prioritized in terms of the eligibility. And the EV and CNG infrastructure could be located anywhere in the state, so did not have to be in a non-attainment or maintenance area under the national air quality standards, as long as that didn't compete with existing private facilities. Now, under the FAST Act, priority was added for funding of EV and CNG infrastructure on designated corridors under the AFC program. So corridors that either had a ready or pending designation were to receive some kind of priority within the state for EMV and CNG infrastructure. The CMAQ program can provide funding for signage for EMV and CNG infrastructure anywhere, and it's limited to non-attainment maintenance areas for all other alt fuels for the signage. This is a little tricky one, and one we have to explain a lot. You can place alternative fuel facilities and rest areas on the right of way. However, you cannot charge a fee for that. So if you're gonna place a facility, it has to be free, either the charging or the fueling, which doesn't exactly do much for the business case. But right now there's a prohibition in law under Title 23, Section 111 about commercializing the right of way. And that's a long held section of law, and therefore, no fee can be charged. Just a little bit about the CMAQ program and what they're doing. There's an emissions calculator toolkit that has both alternative fuel vehicle and public and private infrastructure tool associated with it. They have some updated cost effectiveness tables, and coming soon will be a fact sheet specifically looking at the connection between CMAQ and alternative fuel corridors. So I encourage you to take a look at the CMAQ website there I have listed, and take a look for that fact sheet and all the other information related to alternative fuels. One thing I did want to mention is, of course, it's not a federal highway program, it's a Federal Transit Administration program, is the low or no emission vehicle program. And I think most of you are probably familiar with this program. It's a competitive program, provides funding to state and local governmental authorities for the purchase or lease of zero emission or low emission transit buses and the associated infrastructure. So it's about 55, I think in 2020, it was $55 million. The link I have there is actually, will show you the projects that were funded in 2020. I think it was back in June they made the announcement. So I encourage you to take a look at that website too. Next slide. So this is a little bit different in terms of describing, oh no, this is the wrong slide. Sorry, this is the reauthorization. Let me go back to a minute and rethink this. First of all, the House passed, as I mentioned before, the FAST Act expires tomorrow. The House passed, yet to be taken up by the Senate, a FAST Act extension until September 2021. And that's going to be, if passed by the Senate, that will be passed with the continuing resolution that the House passed till December 11th with funding for the federal government. So we'll see what happens there, but obviously the Senate's expected to pass that CR. Let me go back to the reauthorization. There's some language in there, provisions in both the Senate bill, the version of the transportation reauthorization bill, and the House bill for the alternative fuel corridor program. The Senate bill spells out basically, how the program would be administered. You can find that bill online and look at the language. It includes electric vehicles, natural gas, and hydrogen, and it's at about $200 million per year for 5 years, about $1 billion total. The House bill is very much similar to the Senate language, only propane is added as one of the eligible fuels in that program. It's $350 million per year, comes to about $1.4 billion total. So, if I had a crystal ball, I'd love to see what would happen in reauthorization, but I don't. And now we'll have to wait probably a year for to know anything if the extension is passed by the Senate, which it most likely will be. So next slide. This was the slide I was talking about before. That's a little different. Information's a little different probably than what you're used to hearing. And there's probably a lot more detail to it than what I'm going to go over, but this has to do with the FY 2020 appropriations bill, the transportation bill. I think as most people are aware, DOT funding is distributed very differently than, for instance, EPA or Department of Energy. The DOT funding, the federal government, is usually just a pass-through to the states, and that state, the funding is given out to the states based on formula established by Congress in law. So most of the funding is given out that way, although there are programs like Tiger and Infra that are discretionary grant programs, but most of the big dollars are given out by formula. So one thing that happened in FY 2020, this is not a pot of money, it is not a set aside, it strictly establishes eligibility for alternative fuel infrastructure on designated corridors. So under the FY 2020 appropriations bill and the highway infrastructure program, and the funds are from the general treasury, not the highway trust fund, there is an eligibility for alternative fuel infrastructure on designated corridors. So I gave you a website there of a memo that was written last February that describes the policy associated with this and how the formula works. The funds are available till September 30th, 2023. And I think I mentioned before, there's a House pass CR extending funding until December 11th, 2020. So we'll see in the FY 2021 appropriations if the same funds exist and if the same eligibility exists for alternative fuel infrastructure. So just a little bit on last fiscal year, we gave out some, really it was research money. It was not for infrastructure, alternative fuel infrastructure. It was for planning of for the deployment of alternative fuel infrastructure. So we had a little competitive program, and we funded 3 state DOTs, you see on the screen there, and 2 MPOs for their corridor plans to deploy infrastructure. And that's really getting folks ready from if they have pending corridors, how a strategic plan of deployment will get them to a ready corridor. So you can see there, most of them include considerations for electric vehicles and CNG, and also the North Central Texas Council of Governments, NCTCOG, and the PEMA Association of Governments in Arizona are looking at hydrogen on their corridors too. So just about everyone is in the process of developing those plans. I think some of them will be done sooner than others, simply because it was just easier for some entities to get the program up and running. So stay tuned for information on those plans. As we get them, we'll post them on our Alternative Fuel Corridor website. Next slide, please. And I think is the last slide. Just a little bit more information. If you have any questions on the corridor program, you can always contact me, or many of you know Mike Scarpino and Stephen Costa, who are with the Volpe Transportation Center. They help me administer the program, and are 2 great sources of alternative fuel information. There I have listed the Alternative Fuel Corridor website on Federal Highway site, and a little bit on the signage. This is the MUTCD, which is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's the official signing for alternative fuel corridors for both corridor and directional signage. There's a memo that spells out the policy for that. And also the DOE MRAL, Alternative Fueling Station Locator, that now has a corridor tool on it that you can actually measure one station to the next and see how many miles in between. So with that, I'll stop and see if there are any pressing questions.
Thank you, Diane. I just want to remind participants that they can type questions into the Q&A box and we will get to them. One quick question for you, Diane, before we move on to Yuska. What updates are there for CMAQ funding in 2021 that are holistic, not just alt fuel corridor?
That I'm not sure what updates there will be. I'd have to check with our CMAQ folks. You can always contact, to actually get the real answer to that question, Mark Glaze, who's the national CMAQ contact, and it's just mark.glaze@dot.gov, and you can ask him if there are any updates for 2021, but I will also pass that question along to him.
Thank you very much.
Robin, thank you.
All right, let's go on to our last presenter, and then we will open it up for a large question and answer period. Dan Yuska is an environmental protection specialist with the U.S. Maritime Administration's Office of Environment. He helped to develop the Maritime Environmental and Technical Assurance Program, which you're going to be hearing more about, and leads environmental research and policy within the agency. Prior to development of the META program, Daniel led agency environmental planning efforts for major port and intermodal infrastructure projects. In addition, he's also been a member of the U.S. delegation to the International Maritime Organization. Daniel holds both a BS and an MS in environmental and ecological science disciplines. Daniel, take it away, please.
All righty, well, thank you, Carl. I appreciate it. I also appreciate the conference team for the invitation. And Maddie, if we could go to my slide deck. All right, next slide, please. So what I want to talk about is the Maritime Technical Assistance Program. It used to be called, for those that are aware and have some experience with it, it used to be called the Maritime Environmental and Technical Assistance Program, but it was changed back in January of this year because we received additional language for the program in the National Defense Reauthorization. So essentially, what the program is designed for is to assist maritime stakeholders with addressing emerging maritime environmental concerns. With the NDAA reauthorization update, it allows a broader focus on safety and underwater noise as well. So what we do, if anybody heard me a couple of years back out in Sacramento, we work with the industry and other government agencies and academia to address what the major maritime environmental concerns really are. So this can be through a demonstration project, data gathering, research, and then since 2010, we've been funded on an annual basis, usually $3 to $4 million. So it's not very big, but we use that really well. So next slide, please. Okay, so I briefly touched on this. So under MTA, Merit is authorized to engage in environmental study, research, development, assessment, deployment of emerging marine technologies and practices. A lot of our work, in fact, we try to make most of our work publicly available. So each project will have a project paper. A lot of those papers have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Demonstration projects typically involved, it could be one of our vessels. We have a couple of training vessels that are located at the State Maritime Academies. We also work with private vessels too. So we've worked with a lot of the major shipping companies that you've probably heard of, such as Crowley and Tote. We work with Foss. And then of course, we work with ports as well. There's a lot of interesting projects that we have completed at some ports. So the big picture of this program, in the past, say maybe 20 years ago, there was not a lot of information available, at least for the maritime sector with regards to emissions, invasive species, what really can be transferred from the shore side to a ship. So the big picture is that we try to gather data and disseminate it. Basically, that helps to inform good policy decisions. And it also helps the industry out just to see really what can work on a ship or at a port, whether it's emission reduction, and then usually what the costs are. So the next slide, please. All right, so this is not a grant program. We fund things through cooperative agreements. So this allows us to have a little more participation as far as being a little more active in these projects. And then it gives us a lot more flexibility as far as changing up a scope, adding a scope to the project, building on the lessons learned. So, and then with our federal partners, we do work very closely with the Coast Guard, the DOE, the US EPA. If we're working on projects with those entities, we'll use the interagency agreements. We really want large partnerships. There's a lot of reasons. One of which, if you do any demonstration project really on a ship, it's very, very costly. So we leverage a lot of funding. And then there's usually a cost sharing component. If we decide to go out with a request for proposals, we'll have a cost sharing component there. And it can be on the financial end, or in some cases, we'll have partners provide a lot of the in-kind expertise. And then I already mentioned it's not a grant program. The next slide, please. So this is just to give you a flavor of some of the projects. And I see that John in the chat part listed our direct link to the Meta webpage. So far to date, taken out some of the water quality projects dealing with invasive species, vessel general permit stuff, from an air emission and energy conservation, energy efficiency perspective. We've worked a lot of projects testing biofuels, alternative technology such as fuel cells. There's a lot of hybrid work that we're currently doing. We've worked with a couple of the major universities for in situ emission testing on ships. We've worked with throughout the country with some of our EPA partners on repowers and conversions. We've looked into shore power, port electrification. I already mentioned fuel cells. Well, hydrogen is a big component of it. We did a lot of work looking at LNG. We're recently looking at more shipboard energy efficiency, power management options. So there's really not one size that will fit really every ship. So you may have a technology and a fuel that you're kind of using at the same time on a ship. And so that's going to require power management while you're on the ship. And then something that's relatively new is the autonomous type of applications. So we're working with a company or two right now. If you think of autonomous cars, there are some applications for smaller boats that are currently underway. I don't think that you'll see a big cargo carrier, a cargo vessel in a fully autonomous type of situation really anytime soon. And then multimodal modeling. So years ago, we were trying to actually answer the questions, how do you compare emissions, apples to apples, from a ship versus a train versus a truck? So some of the modeling that we have done back in the past has really come from that. TEAMS is the total energy and emissions analysis of marine systems, and GIFT is the geospatial intermodal freight transport tool. And of course, as I mentioned before, we do a lot of other projects outside of the air quality field. So we've done a lot of work with ship invasive species, hull fouling, noise. We looked at some of the blockchains recently to see if that will work from a maritime perspective, and then some integrative AIS weather monitoring. The next slide, please. All right, so this is a list of our partners, and I know since I'm mainly talking to a West Coast audience, I'll just do a shout out to the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. I saw a couple of folks were at least logged on from there. We have worked very closely with University of California, Riverside. There is a state Maritime Academy in California, excuse me, which we've done a lot of work with. We've also worked with a lot of the shippers on the West Coast. We're currently working with Crowley, but we work with the Umbros out of Hawaii, Foss, Tote. So that's just kind of a flavor of our various partnerships. As I mentioned previously, a lot of our work goes to really informing good policy decisions. So we really work very closely with the Coast Guard, DOE, US EPA, both at headquarters and also a lot of the regional offices. The next slide, please. So this is my last slide. This is how to get in touch with us. Like I said, our website is posted in the chat. We're available to talk about what projects that we do. If you have any projects that you think would possibly fit, you can send an email to meta@dot.gov, or you can contact me directly. And that's pretty much it. When we do announce, just for a public announcement, recently it's been on beta.sam.gov. We used to post on the grants.gov site, but I think we're only posting to the beta.sam.gov site these days. So with that, I will open it up for questions, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I encourage folks to enter questions into the Q&A box, and we will get the expert panel to address them. I wanted to make a pitch. If you have not already, please sign up for the West Coast Collaborative newsletter. You can do this by going to the West Coast Collaborative website. That will keep you informed about various DERA releases. That West Coast Collaborative website also has a wealth of information on it. So while folks are typing in questions, I have some questions for the panel, and I'm going to ask you all to put on your prognostication hats. And Dan, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned partnerships, public-private partnerships. How do you see MARAD's priorities evolving over the years to come, taking a look at these partnerships, whether public-private or with other federal agencies?
Well, this is something that we've had the public-private partnerships for quite some time, really, under this Maritime Technical Assistance Program. I don't think that we could have done half the projects that we have done without those partnerships. Of course, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we don't receive a lot of funding, so the cost to do a demonstration project is really huge, and usually you can pick up a lot of steam if you have a few partners. It seems to help the project carry out a little bit better, get the project done really on time. And then if there's any changes in the project itself or the scope, it's really helpful to have multiple partners so that everybody can really weigh in, make changes just at that time.
Thank you. Diane.
Yes.
There's been a lot of work on designating corridors. Do you see any changes in the future when it comes to actually implementing large-scale projects along those corridors as far as funding being made available?
Well, as I mentioned, you know, we're looking towards the next transportation reauthorization bill, which has provisions to fund the corridor program, but we will just have to wait and see what happens. And as I mentioned, it looks like there's going to be a year's extension on our current FAST Act. So, you know, hopefully there'll be something available in the next transportation reauthorization bill, but we will just have to wait and see.
Thank you. Mike Laughlin.
Yes.
The Department of Energy does a lot of great work around research and development. What about implementation? Could you talk where you think your agency might be going in the future around funding of in-practice projects rather than research projects?
Sure, I think that's basically what the Technology Integration Program and our Clean Cities Coalitions are all about, is to do that kind of work to move projects that we do, technologies that we do in research and development, and move them into the real world and test them. And one of the things we like to do, like to talk about recently, is the feedback loop, to learn from those demonstrations. You know, what did we learn? What things work well? What things don't work well? As a way to feedback to our research projects, to guide our future research. So I think, pending budget, you know, the usual caveats about pending budget legislation, I think we'll be continuing to do those sorts of things, and certainly the Tech Integration Program and our Clean Cities Coalitions are the way we're going to be doing that.
Great,
Can
thank
I
you.
add something to that?
Please.
for about, I don't know, 6 years now, 6+, we've been working with a lot of offices at the DOE, such as the Biofuel Technology Office, the Fuel Cell Tech Office, and they do a really good job as far as building off of lessons learned. I know that with a lot of our partner projects, we keep expanding kind of upon them as we do one project and then learn something interesting. Well, then we build off of that. So that's worked really, really well.
Thank you. A question for Faye. Would you please clarify the infrastructure portion of DERA, because currently it only applies to electrical charging. Could you expand a little bit on that, Faye, and perhaps speak where you think that is going to go in the future?
Sure. I don't know if you can turn my video on. It doesn't matter. It says you've turned me off. But in general, we don't fund infrastructure. We don't fund CNG infrastructure. We don't fund biodiesel infrastructure. We don't fund propane infrastructure. And we don't fund electrification or charging stations as a standalone thing. If you are doing, we do fund truck stop electrification or electrified parking spaces. So this could be a trucker rest stop, or maybe reefer plugins at a distribution center. So in that case, portions, I mean, you know, the infrastructure kind of is the technology, you know, in those cases. And so we will pay, you know, for some portion of the cabling and the conduit and the, you know, breaking ground and installing, you know, the electrical piece of it for certain types of technologies. If you're purchasing an electric vehicle, so an electric school bus or an electric terminal tractor or something like that, the kiosk and the charging cable can be rolled into the purchase price of the vehicle, but that's it. We don't pay for the installation of that. We don't pay to like run cable or any electrical upgrades in order to install that. So, you know, the logic for this is that we don't really pay for infrastructure. So we tried to make the difference between, you know, the types of technologies where like electricity is the fuel, right? Like, as opposed to like charging. Because that's, you know, charging is different than plugging something in to run on electricity full time. So we make distinctions between all those different things, and depending on the project, some parts are eligible and some aren't. I don't see that changing in the near future. We just don't have that kind of funding. We don't have the kind of funding to put in CNG stations to support a CNG fleet. There wouldn't be any money for anyone else. You know, we don't have the kind of funds, you know, to put in large scale electrical infrastructure. You know, those costs can just get outrageous really fast. And so we are sticking to what we know, which is the vehicles. And that's where our policy is right now.
Thank you, Faye.
Mm-hmm.
An open question for the panelists. When I look at all of you and your involvement in this field for the last number of years, I'm going to ask you to draw upon trends you've noticed developing over those years and project out to the future. Where do you think your programs are going? For example, on the EPA side, we're seeing more purchasing of new vehicles rather than retrofits as a trend. What are some interesting trends developing in each of your sectors that you are looking forward to as far as energy efficiency and emission reductions? And how are you going to fund those?
So I've got a crystal ball here, Karl, and No, I'm just kidding. From our perspective, we see less of the fuels and more of the tech, a lot more of the tech side of things. So we see hybrids are very popular right now. Energy efficiency is becoming really, really big. And of course, there's a direct correlation with emission reduction. So we're looking at fuel cells too. Now, they're not really there yet for the larger ships, as far as you're not going to see a big fuel cell bank on an 800-foot cargo ship probably within the next 5 years or so. But for some of the smaller workboat type of applications, that's really coming quickly. So we're seeing hydrogen as a big player too. So less of the biofuels and a little more of the tech side of things. And I think, I mean, of course, this stuff is very expensive, but a lot of our partnerships, such as our DOE partnerships, that helps pay for a lot of the research. When we partner, we can leverage up to half the funds, and if they kick in half, then if we have one of the industry partners, well, then it usually pays off.
Yeah, and from the DOE side, you know, obviously we feel like our Clean Cities Coalitions and our Clean Cities program has been a pretty resilient and sturdy program. It's celebrated 25 years a couple of years ago, more than 25 years right now. So we feel like that will continue to be one of our main ways of getting the technologies we research and information we have about technologies out to all of our stakeholders and to make a broad national impact. You know, obviously, along with virtually everybody else in the transportation world, there's been a whole lot of information and excitement about electrification. So we're certainly, to the extent that we're on anybody's bandwagon as sort of a fuel neutral program, we're on that bandwagon. We're supporting that with some of the things I mentioned today. But we haven't forgotten about the other alternative fuels that our fleet partners are using right now to save money and clean up the environment. So I think those things will continue, and we'll see what the future holds.
Carl, I have the same crystal ball as Dan, which is no crystal ball at all. But in terms of trends and the way you see things going, you know, as more of the driving public are purchasing electric vehicles and hopefully someday, you know, hydrogen, you know, basically I look at it from kind of where I am at Federal Highway and the DOT perspective. And I think, you know, state DOT, state and local transportation agencies are really going to have to take a hard look at that and look at their policies and programs and make sure that, you know, if this is the trend coming, that, you know, considerations are there, that if there are barriers, how to deal with those barriers to electrification, or if there are funding issues, how to, you know, take a look at the funding. And just as that Appropriations Act does, establishes eligibility for a huge pot of money, but it's still up to the state DOT if they want to use their funds for that or something else. So, you know, the trends are there. I think it's just a matter of people, especially in the transportation community, wrapping their head around that this is part of you know, their world too now, which things didn't used to fall under their umbrella, and now they do, and things have to kind of shift and change a little bit to deal with that.
Thanks. Faye, did you want to weigh in on this topic? Because if not, I've got a follow-up question for you.
I was just going to add that I feel like about once a week we have this question where we talk about, you know, there's so much excitement about electrification, and you know, so many people feel strongly that, you know, we should just be going straight to zero emission. You know, and in a perfect world, that would be wonderful, right? But again, you know, there's two parts to it. You know, one, we just don't have that kind of money. And two, you know, right now in the heavy duty sector, we're not there yet. You know, there are certain vehicle types that are having success with electric, but you know, we're not even close in other sectors. So DERA has always had the perspective that we offer kind of everything and we let the fleet owners choose what works for them. So we have started, we do give additional financial incentive for the cleaner technologies, the low NOx and the zero emission vehicles, but they cost a lot more. So, we did make that change a few years ago where we give more funding for those things, but, we plan to continue to kind of offer the suite of options because, it's just not everyone has the infrastructure or, the capability to do their whole fleet turnover at this time, nor is the technology there for every sector. So, for now, our plan is to kind of continue to offer the suite of options and let the fleets choose what's going to work best for them.
Thank you, Faye. A question came in around a clarification on the DERA program. Can DERA be used to modernize an old municipal CNG station? So it sounds like parts of it are still in working order, but other parts need modernization.
Yeah, that would not be an eligible use of DERA funds. We pay for the vehicles and the engines and the retrofits, but we don't do fueling infrastructure.
Thank you. Here's a question for Diane. What are the kilogram limits for allowing hydrogen through tunnels, et cetera, so that it can be treated as non-hazmat? Diane, you might be muted.
I'm so sorry. I was just saying, my office would not deal with tunnels and hazmat, so I have no idea, but that question would probably be answered best by one of the tunnel engineers in the Office of Infrastructure at Federal Highway. So I can come up with a name for Walter, or he can email me offline and I can provide him with a name.
Thank you, Diane. Any additional questions for our panel? I'm going to wait for a second to see if anyone types in a final question. While doing that, Maddie, thank you very much for all of your technical support. Your assistance made this go swimmingly well. Thank you. All right, seeing no additional questions, I want to thank the expert panelists. We really appreciate your time and all of the effort you put into presenting us with this great information. We'll be talking to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.